Morning, folks. I'm Pamela Young, and this is Thrive 2030, brought to you by growthcurv. And today I have with me Matthew Fortier, who is the Chief Executive of Accelerate in Canada. So he's on the Pacific Rim. How are you today, Matthew?
Well, Pamela, how are you?
Very well, thanks. It's a pleasure for us to have you join us today. Now, the reason I have reached out to talk with you is because Accelerate is a brand new organization that has been set up to create a new industry, the electric vehicle industry, and your job is to help establish the supply chain, I understand.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And so this is an organization that came together through 2021, and we launched in September 2021.
Yeah.
And the idea is to bring together companies that are across the supply chain and value chain in zero emission vehicles, primarily electric vehicles at the moment, but also hydrogen powered and other zero emission vehicles. The rationale being that Canada actually has a lot of what it takes to build these vehicles, right? So from critical minerals that go into the batteries to the R&D and human capital expertise through to an auto manufacturing and parts manufacturing ecosystem that has been existent in Canada for decades now. So really what we need is a plan, and that's what Accelerate was formed to do.
So you're in a very privileged position to have every element of the supply chain probably within your own country. I'm just going to change my background here to an image which is one of the thoughts that stimulated me to come searching for you. A little while back, I've been interviewing a number of people who have had supply chain challenges across the world. And of course, one of the things that we're trying to do with Thrive 2030 is look to uncover discussions that will help people make the transition that they need to make so that we're all here at 2030 and that we're all thriving and we're surviving. And of course, late last year, COP26 raised some issues around coal, fossil fuels. And then, of course, that led us to the conversation around the challenges for the transport industry, shipping, trucks and cars. Now, this is an image here on the background of my screen of Toyota's promotion of some of its 30 electric vehicles that it hopes to establish by 2030, which is quite a big ambition. So I mean, obviously they are ahead of the game, but in Canada, you have established this organization in September last year to be able to create a nationwide industry to be able to do what's going on here at Toyota. Can you tell me what were the drivers behind the establishment of Accelerate?
Yeah, and so in Canada, we really are quite lucky to have a lot of what it takes to be competitive and relevant in the sort of global zero emission vehicle landscape. So, I mentioned critical minerals earlier, and the rare earth minerals that it takes to make these electric motors. But, higher up the value chain, you've got, R&D expertise through universities, and you've got, advanced manufacturers that kind of are populated across the country. And you've got, of course, auto parts manufacturing and auto assembly. A lot of the global OEMs are in Canada, and we've got, a really healthy relationship with our American friends that sort of cross-border trade. Billions of dollars go across the border every day in auto parts and auto and assembled vehicles. So this is a relationship that's really existed for 60 plus years. And so we've got a really strong backbone in the vehicle sector, and that's really only just passenger vehicles. We've got a strong medium and heavy duty vehicle sector as well. So, but you're right, Pam. I mean, this is a new sector in a lot of ways. These aren't the same modes of transport that have existed. And so, what we need to do in Canada is figure out how are we going to leverage all of what we've got already to be relevant in what is essentially a new industry. And Toyota is a great example. Absolutely, they're making a lot of electric and hybrid vehicles, and they're making big bets. But a lot of the OEMs are as well. I mean, they're all, if you watch television, you watch the commercials. Basically, all of the car ads right now are for electric or hybrid vehicles. I mean, that's really what they're pushing. That's a good news story. And what Canada needs to do is position itself to be part of that, North American and global supply chain too, because we actually can feed this, and the demand is huge. It's going to just get bigger and bigger for a whole bunch of reasons that I'm sure we'll discuss. But there are regulatory and government pushes to get people into electric vehicles, for example. So the demand is only going to get bigger. So where's that supply going to come from? And Canada can play a big role in that.
Yes, one of the things that excited me about discovering your organisation, Accelerate, is that over the last 12 months, I've had conversations with manufacturers in Australia who are trying to get their electric trucks funded.
Sure.
And then also I've spoken with logistics companies, around the world, and they have said, look, we're not going to be switching from fossil fuel or combustion engine trucks anytime soon because there just aren't enough electric truck options. And this, raises questions for how we're going to manage the climate change challenge. And I do think that your initiative is something that people around the Pacific and Asia would be able to learn from. So can you tell us a little bit about what you think some of the hurdles are going to be for you to deliver this result? Because you've got a mindset shift, I think. Your proportion of electric vehicles at the moment is 3%.
Yeah, it's about 3% of new vehicles sold last year. It is ticking up and up, which is a good news story. And only yesterday, actually, the federal government announced new targets and mandates to get people into zero emission vehicles. So the idea being that by 2035, all new vehicles sold in Canada, at least, will be zero emission. And that's on the passenger vehicle side. And then I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it goes from 20% by 2026, and then 50 by 2030, then 100 by 2035. And that's reflected also in the medium and heavy duty vehicle space. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a challenge in actually adopting this. And part of it is a mindset challenge, but part of it is just the fact that not enough of these vehicles exist yet, right? Particularly in the medium and heavy duty space. So, if you think about your example in Australia, absolutely. If I were, tasked with purchasing, 50 or 100 trucks with life cycle of whatever it is, 7, 8, 10 years, to say, well, okay, well, I've got a certain budget, and I've got to get my people into, safe, efficient, effective vehicles. But I can't get them into electrified vehicles right now because there aren't enough of them. And what there is are really, really expensive. And there are incentive programs in many jurisdictions, but it's still not an attractive proposition for some. So that's a big challenge. And going back to what I was saying before, Canada has a role to play. Australia has a role to play. A lot of countries that have got access to, say, critical minerals, or have got strong mining sectors, or who have something to add to this supply chain, have got to really lean into this, because if not, the supply is just not going to be there, right? The demand will be there because we're pushing the demand. Yes. And investors are putting their money into, ESG focused investments, which is great. You have to make sure that there's enough supply to meet the demand. And so that's really what I think, that there's a success story waiting to be told, but we really need to align, the priorities to make sure that we can be successful here. And we need to make sure that, at least in Canada, that all of those pieces of the supply chain that we have that are somewhat siloed in a lot of ways, and I'll just leverage off of that. We don't have all the pieces yet, right? We need to process more minerals. We need, we have lithium in the ground, for example, but we're not getting it out. And we have to process it, and then it needs to be delivered to the battery manufacturing. And we've had some really great announcements recently about battery manufacturing being built in Canada, and in Quebec and Ontario in particular, which is great. But they need to be built. There's still a timeline there of 2025, 26. So, there's a delta that we need to address, because right now people want to be in electric vehicles. So I think the message is, all of the countries that have got something to add to this supply chain really do need to be focused on doing so, because the demand is going to be there, the money's going to be there. There are huge opportunities. I mean, it is about the climate. We'll get back to the COP you mentioned, but it's also about economies. It's about jobs. It's about future opportunities for jurisdictions.
Absolutely, yes. Now let's start at the beginning of the supply chain with the mining of the minerals. What's the hurdle there for you in Canada?
Well, I mean, frankly, there are not enough of them, and so we know that we have most of the critical minerals. We don't have all of them, and we don't have all the rare earth minerals, but we have a lot of them. But we're not mining them because they haven't been economic to mine, right? I mean, so the price of lithium always wasn't what it is today, and so it wasn't economical to mine these things in open mines. So that's a challenge. And then there's the timeline challenge, right? So it takes anywhere between 5 and 10 years to open a new mine. And there are good reasons for that. I mean, there are regulatory hurdles that need to get through. And in Canada, just as in a lot of jurisdictions,
that's a long time. Right? Yeah.
Can you speed
that up? Is there some way to speed that up? 5 to 7 years is all. I mean, that's not going to meet the 2030 goal.
No, and that's just it. So of course, we will, of course, as we're making batteries and making electric vehicles and other zero emission vehicles, it will be reliant on foreign inputs as well, right? Whether they be from China or elsewhere, and that's fine. I mean, this is a global industry at the end of the day. But there is getting back to the mining example. I mean, there are regulatory hurdles that we need to get through in Canada, just as is the case in New Zealand or in Australia or many other jurisdictions. There are Indigenous engagement issues that need to be addressed. I mean, we have to make sure that we have full partnerships with our Indigenous peoples who live on the land, and it's in many cases is their land. And so we need to make sure that the economics makes sense for everybody, the partnership models make sense for everybody. So that's something that needs to be addressed as well. But that doesn't need to be a hurdle. It's a challenge that we have to address, but it's certainly I think surmountable, particularly given the opportunity in front of us. So the mining part of this is a challenge, but it's something that we can address.
Okay, and in terms of the manufacturing of vehicles, what vehicles are manufactured in Canada today, and how many of those manufacturers are already making electric vehicles?
Yeah, so you've seen recent announcements of GM and Honda, Stellantis, all committing to making electric vehicles in Canada. So these are great news stories. And we've got Toyota manufacturers here as well. You're going to see more and more of that because a lot of what is produced in Canada is sold in the United States. So the market being what it is in the States and the demand being what it is, eventually you're going to see more and more zero emission vehicles being produced in Canada, which is great. We've got a really important sector of our economy that will be sustained that way. 500,000 jobs are related to the auto sector. So we need to make sure that those jobs are not only protected, but, evolve over time. And so you're going to see more and more of these mandates coming to Canada. We've seen some really good news announcements recently. So, there are plenty of makes and models, whether they be passenger or light duty trucks that are produced in Canada. And, on the heavier duty side, we've got really, strong manufacturing in Quebec in particular, around trucks and buses that are not only produced and sold in Canada, they're sold widely in the United States as well. So there's a huge market and a burgeoning market in Canada. And they're also, in some cases, making their own batteries, which is really interesting. Yes.
Outside of trucks and cars, what other vehicles are you hoping to electrify?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So the electrification journey is happening kind of across the spectrum of mobility. So we've got members who are in, electric boats and electric snowmobiles, which some of your members may never, these viewers may never have seen, but snowmobiles are a popular pastime in many parts of this country. But traditionally they're actually fairly heavy emitting. And so once you electrify some of these things, it really does make a difference, particularly to local environments, but it's also great business. I mean, people who enjoy nature and are on boats or on snowmobiles, for example, and sea-doos, they actually enjoy nature and they want to protect nature. Now this is a great option for them.
Yes. Some of these vehicles are what do you call it? Macho sports vehicles, a bit like SUVs and some of the big heavy trucks. Sure. And, because transitioning people out of their diesel trucks and into an electric one it's a mindset shift, isn't it? But what's your plan to try and get people through this hurdle? I mean, have you got some key messaging around that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it is something that I think about because people have got emotional attachments to their vehicles, of course, and so and I think they buy a vehicle that reflects their personality. They think reflects their personality, whether it's a sports car or an SUV or a pickup truck or whatever it might be. And what I'm seeing personally is that actually there's some really neat models that are electrified that really are cool, that have got a lot of power, that are going to actually fit that personality of the person who would have bought the heavy emitting diesel truck, for example. Well, there's a really powerful electric version of that as well. You're not sacrificing performance here. So, you know, I think what's going to happen, in my view, is people are just going to have to try it. There will be doubters along the way, right? Of course. But once you drive these things, it's an experience. It's different from driving what you're driving now. Of course, the reality is at some point, we're all going to be driving electrified or zero emission vehicles. It is just going to happen. It'll happen in different time scales across the world, of course. But, you know, in Canada, it's absolutely the case. I say to my kids, you're not likely going to drive an internal combustion engine vehicle. You know, they're young enough for that to be the case in Canada, given the timelines I told you. So, you know, that means that people like me and my generation are just going to have to get used to it. And that means just trying it. Once you try it, you are impressed.
I guess that's the thing, isn't it? But the other thing that's going through my mind is a lot of blokes like to work on their trucks, and maybe they think that, you know, a battery driven truck or a battery driven car is not going to be so much fun to work on, or maybe they feel anxious because they won't know how to work on it. Is there an element of that involved?
Well, you know, if it's performance or reliability, I think that those myths are going to be dispelled fairly quickly. I mean, you know, it gets pretty cold here, and you know, the tests are done in -30, -35 degrees Celsius weather. So
it's very cold.
and the batteries work, and they work well. The development and the R&D in batteries in particular has been incredibly impressive, even over the last 5-6 years. I mean, it really has come a long way. And then the reliability, I mean, the range of 400 or 500 kilometers right now is kind of what we're seeing before you have to fully recharge. So, you know, Australia is a big country, for example. Canada's a big country. And of course, you could drive 500 kilometers and not be anywhere near your destination, but there's charging infrastructure being developed as well. And so, you know, at some point in the near future, I really do think you're not going to suffer for lack of charging, just as you wouldn't suffer for lack of petrol station or whatever it might be along the way. And so, you know, the idea that you're sacrificing anything in an electric vehicle is just not going to be true. But having said that, I also understand the hesitancy. I do. I mean, it's a different thing. And, you know, in some people's minds, they might be thinking, well, am I just going to be driving a glorified golf cart around? And it's just not the case.
No. Some of the arguments from fleet, well, some of the challenges for fleet owners making the switch, of course, is price, because you know, some of the big stores around, you know, the nations that I've spoken to have said, yes, we're going to give electric trucks and deliveries of, you know, goods around the nation. We'll give it a go, but the transition is too pricey at the moment because there isn't enough production to get the cost of that truck down to a price that they can make that transition. What do you think are some of the, you know, strategies that you will employ to try and shift that in Canada? Because if we can't get the volume up, we can't get the price down. I mean, and getting through the mindset, all of these things are colliding, aren't they? So what strategies will you employ to help address that production, boost that production?
Right. So we talked a little bit about, you know, getting more of the inputs online, whether they be critical minerals or cathode and anode materials for batteries. And that has to come, and it has to come more quickly than it is. And we are focused on that. And I know other people around the world are focused on those types of projects as well. And, you know, I think the bridge is going to be incentivization, right? So financial incentives. And, you know, there are different models around the world. But, you know, for fleets in particular, it's going to be important for them to sort of see the ROI, you know, be fairly apparent and not take too long, right? So if whatever model makes sense for whatever business. If you sort of say, look, I need an ROI of, within 3 years, that has to be there, right? And so I think there need to be conversations between industry and government on the incentive models that make sense. Otherwise, the adoption is just not going to be there. And look, I think the other factor here is, we talked about ESG a little bit earlier, particularly for public companies, but it's not just in the public company space. Shareholders and other stakeholders are putting pressure on companies to adopt a cleaner.
True. Yeah, definitely are doing that. Yeah.
And so, I think there's only so much time you can, I call it skating, right? So there's only so much time you can sort of say, oh yeah, we're going to do it before you have to do it. Because shareholders in particular will say, what have you done for me lately? And if you haven't, then that's a challenge.
Yes, shareholders are definitely putting pressure. The interesting, one thing that always interests me is the CEO has a 3 to 5 year term, and the question that they are also playing off in their mind is, of all the things I've got to do, I've got to finish dealing with the pandemic, I've got to make sure my digital transformation goes really, really well. I've got to achieve, as many sustainability targets as I can, because I've got to report on those. I've got the whole gender thing I've got to deliver on as well. And there's so many priorities. And of course, let's not forget growth and profit. So when you introduce another thing, which is, hey, by the way, you've got a massive fleet and you need to transition that to electric. That's another major task. It requires capital investment and commitment and, of course, delivery. So I'm just wondering, what do you think about, the challenges that chief executives are facing with all of those things today? And you're right that investors are pushing for it, and particularly younger generations. And COP26 last year raised the awareness of our need to, address these climate change issues faster. And I think you're right. We just have to, at some point, get on with it. And people are getting on with it, but not enough. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about how chief executives might be weighing up this in the balance with those other priorities.
I might take a different lens to that. So, there's a 3 to 5 year time frame for a CEO, but there's a 10 to 15 year time frame for a board director, right? And so, boards at some point do need to decide what's important for this company, what's important for this brand, what does this brand stand for, and what's the culture? And I don't just mean the internal culture, but what's the culture that we're trying to be a part of and contribute to? And then you try to integrate that into the strategy of the business, right? And so if the strategy of the business is such that if you can integrate, in this case, the E within ESG into the strategy and figure out how to make money from that, right? Then it's apparent. Then the CEO will do it willingly, because they sort of say, we figured it out. We figured out why an electrified fleet makes sense for this company and why we'll invest in this. And we figured out the marketing around it, or whatever the case may be. But you're absolutely right. If you look at the dollars and cents in the short term, and if you sort of say, well, I've got 3 more years on the job, and what I want to do is maximize, the share value, and I want to get bonused out, et cetera, then that's probably not the best way of looking at electrification. But if you sort of say, well, we are actually putting together a strategy wherein electrification of the fleet, in this example, is going to make us money. And the board has not only blessed it, but they're driving it because they are saying this is a long-term play for the company. Then I think it changes the dynamic and the conversation.
I'm glad you've mentioned boards, Matthew, because throughout this Thrive 2030 journey, I've spoken to quite a number of board members who have said to me very honestly, well, look, pandemic was on our risk radar, but we didn't consider it a great risk, so we really didn't have a plan. And of course, now they will have a plan. It will be considered something that is possible, very possible. This climate change is still thought to be a few years out, even though we recognise that it's got to be addressed. And boards, have historically been very focused on a shorter term vision, even though their role might be there for 10 to 15 years. They're still focused on delivering results today to keep shareholders and investors happy. So it's a bit of a challenge for them, isn't it? But you know, let's hope that with the initiatives around the world, by like, if you just look at that vision behind me, you know, Toyota, you know, they've got SUVs in the corner and a truck, and they've got some other utility vehicles up there that look like, you know, wagons for, you know, distributing goods. There's a sports car there and a couple of little mini vehicles. I mean, there's quite a big range. And as these start to roll out to the market, you know, some nations will get to that target of making all new vehicles electric. Only to allow only new electric vehicles to be purchased, I'm trying to say. And so as that starts to come on, then, you know, the pressure will flood across the world, won't it? And it'll happen in a bit of a hurry. What is your time frame to try and achieve your outcomes of transitioning everybody to electric?
Yeah, and so, well, I mean, you know, my focus right now is on the supply chain. So my time frame is, you know, 5 years, and within that 5 years we will have a strategy for the country, and we will start acting against that strategy. And that means, you know, having detailed planning around critical minerals exploration and development and processing of these minerals and metals, et cetera, all the way down to you know, more vehicles produced, purchased, and then recycling the batteries and the vehicles. So that's the time frame that we're looking at for the supply chain. The time frame, and we talked about this earlier, for getting more people into electric vehicles or everybody transition. Well, that, you know, as I mentioned, our federal government has sort of targeted 2035 as you're going to be buying or leasing an electric vehicle, because you're not going to have an option, right? Yeah. So, you know, do those two timeframes clash? I don't think so, but I think there is going to need to be, as I mentioned before, a bridge, right? So how do you make sure that more and more people want to be in these vehicles? That's going to be incentivization, and that is part of our federal government's plan anyway, and many of the provinces as well. I mean, you know, there's a big role for subnational governments here too, because that's, you know, they're the ones who, in Canada at least, who administer the roads and all sorts of things. And so there are different rules across the country. So look, my time frame for the supply chain to really be fleshed out and to be integrated is 5 years, and to get more people into these vehicles. It's a little bit longer than that, but they have to happen at the same time. It's a concurrent project for sure, and there will be a lag.
Yes. And so what is the year that you're hoping, or is the government hoping to transition everybody into electric vehicles? Is there a target date?
Yeah, so it's purchased by 2035. So I think they've said 50% of all new purchases will be 2030, and then 100% by 2035. So that's quite ambitious if you think about it, right? It's 13 years away. Yeah. And you know, if you think about, you know, boy, I've got 3 more years left on my lease. Does that mean that I should go electric now? Yeah. Right? Or for my next vehicle, or do I wait? Because, you know, because after another 4-year lease, then I'm looking at 7 years, then all of a sudden it's pretty much 2030, and I'll likely have to, because there won't be options, right? I mean, that's the other thing that we're seeing is, you know, talk about the Toyota image behind you, you know, they're going to, I imagine, I'm not on their board and I'm not on their executive team, but you see what's happening in the marketing, and you see what's happening in the vehicle mandates that are being announced across the world and in Canada too. They are moving towards a hybrid and electrified world. So that means that's where they're putting their money and their capital investment. And so, you know, at some point we're just not going to have the option to buy the diesel and the gas powered vehicles anymore.
Yeah, that's right. What part of the conversation at COP25 and COP26 do you think helped this initiative of yours come alive?
Well, look, you know, it's funny, because COP was a little bit of a referendum, or that's not maybe the right word. It was a bit of a revisit of Paris, right? And so when you have countries acting in good faith, and sort of publicly signing on to ambitious targets and goals, that does, I think, catalyze governments when they get back home and they come away from Glasgow or Paris a few years before. They come back and say, well, we said this, we signed a document, and we've told our citizens and our voters that we're going to do this. We better come up with a plan. And so, you know, I don't think it was one specific conversation in those meetings, and there are many of them. It was really just the signal that we're serious about this, and the international community is serious about this. because I know not everybody signs on to these things, but if you have the critical mass of actors sort of saying this is where this has to go, and this is where we're going to invest our time and our resources and our energy, our small e energy, then it's going to happen, and that provides, I think, the market with some predictability. Right, investors can start to get their heads around it. Industry can get their heads around it. They can start to think, okay, so if Canada says net zero by 2050, or Australia says the same thing, or New Zealand says the same, well, industry has to figure out how do we get there, right? And how are we going to make money along the way? And in the transportation sector, that's a little bit more difficult because actually it's been based on carbon emissions. Yes. And so how do we shift that?
Yes. So tell us, Matthew, who are your major investors? Where does your funding come from?
Sure. So our seed capital comes from foundation money. So we've got a number of really strong and prominent foundations in Canada that fund projects that are at the intersection of the environment and the economy. And then after that, it's members who pay dues and fund our research and fund our activities. We have partners as well that work with us and that fund some of our activities. But it's a not-for-profit model. And so what we're really trying to do is, drive a conversation and drive action. And we work with governments along the way, whether they be the federal government or provincial governments, to really try to get the public policy right, so that we can, getting back to that word of predictability, give industry some predictability around, what can Canada achieve, what does good look like in this sector, in that sector, and all the way across the value chain, so that we know where investments need to be made.
Yes. And in terms of finding the people to help you build this supply chain, I think, you mentioned that there might be some challenges there with finding the skills. Where do you think you're going to source them from?
Well, no, it's interesting. So Canada, we're in a bit of a privileged position because we have a lot of skilled labor, just as you would in New Zealand or in Australia, a lot of the countries along the Pacific Rim. The trick is going to be transitioning some of these skills, right? So, for example, to build an internal combustion engine vehicle requires slightly different skills than building electric vehicles, because actually electric vehicles are a much more simple machine. There are far fewer parts in an electric vehicle. So, but that means that the parts that are being made are different than the parts that were being made for the ICE engine vehicle. Yeah. And so you need to transition the auto parts manufacturers as well. And so that's happening across the supply chain. But, there are new engineering jobs. There are new, in battery recycling, there are different and new jobs that didn't exist 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so, the good news is that we've got a highly educated workforce, and we've got, a strong base upon which to build. But there's no question that reskilling needs to happen, retraining needs to happen. And we also, just like every country needs to do this, and it is a war for talent out there, attract the best and the brightest to come, develop IP here in Canada, so that we can, have, some really interesting, new parts and new software and new AI that go into these machines.
Yes, I was just going to ask, is that part of your mandate, which is to, develop an R&D vehicle for supporting the development of the supply chain?
In terms of sort of building sort of a demonstration vehicle?
No, in terms of just R&D to go into the development of this industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another agency that's doing that.
No, so that's exactly right. So that is part of our mandate. So looking at the labor market implications of this transition, and identifying what skills need to be developed and what skills need to be attracted to Canada, and it's everything it's as granular as, okay, so what college courses need to be brought online, what needs to change, and what don't we need to do anymore, right? Because there are choices that will be made along the line. And so that is part of our mandate. That's part of the roadmap that we're building, really, to figure out, okay, so it's everything from the in the ground stuff to the manufacturing stuff, but it's who's doing it, where are we getting the capital from to do it, right? So there's a foreign direct investment question. There's that also kind of our domestic investors, what role do they play? What role does venture capital play in all of this? So there are a lot of moving parts when you're building a new sector, which is essentially what this is,
yes, very
it's
exciting.
yeah, it's very big, but it's achievable if we all kind of put our heads down and work, as I like to say, kind of row in the same direction.
I think it's extremely achievable, absolutely, and it is very exciting. You're getting to create a whole new industry, and you're at the start of it at the time when, there's a little bit of experience already around the world in electric vehicles, and as you say, Toyota and many of the major global manufacturers have made commitments to develop other electric vehicles. So you're right at the sort of past that point of having to convince everybody that it's going to happen. We all know it's going to happen. The question is exactly when, and the pressure is mounting. And I think, you'll probably find over the next year or so that, other nations will reach out to you and say, how did you do this, guys? Because you are pioneering here. And they'll be looking to you for advice.
Well, I think that these kinds of initiatives only work if you partner with people, and I'm happy to partner with anybody internationally as well. This is a Canada-focused project, but this is a global industry, right? Yes. And so, I and my colleagues want to learn as well. So to the extent that we can sort of share any learnings, both positive and negative along the way, we're very happy to do that. Yeah. One of the big things that I'm focused on is, how do we make this an economic success for our entire country? We've got the second biggest country in the world from a landmass perspective, a lot of different parts to where I live, and not, in fact, only a very small part of the country is engaged in the auto sector, as it were. So how do we make this a winning proposition for as many parts of the country as possible, as many provinces? And I think you do that by identifying the economic multiplying opportunities across the sector, right? So yes, from mining and processing, but it's AI and it's software development and it's financial services and advanced manufacturing, and so and every part of our country is engaged in those sectors. And so if we do that, if we look at the economic multiplying opportunities, then all of a sudden you sort of see this as, oh boy, this makes a lot of sense. This is going to be a bigger part of our GDP output than it ever has been, and it's going to make up for some of the things that are going to be transitioning away, right? And so
that's for sure. And I think that's a really it's a noble plan to have, which is to grow all the sectors across all the states and to try and make this a win for everybody, because as you say, it's going to happen and it's going to be sensational. And I do think you're right to mention technology. That might be the one thing that transitions people. I mean, everybody has now realized that the world is offering such amazing technologies, not just phones, but systems in your home that close your curtains and turn on your lights. We're getting used to these things, which are changing our world. We are also getting used to being met by a robot in a hotel who's bringing your food to your room. So, as each of these evolutions occur and become more every day, it's going to make it easier to sell people on this, isn't it?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And if you think about kind of where we are in this time of history, electric cars have been around for a long time. I mean, the base technology has been around for over 100 years, and in the 70s there were electric car manufacturers. But one of the things that's happening now, and this is that we are nearing the age of mass adoption of these things. It's intersecting with the age of mass technological adoption, right? And so, as you mentioned, we're now used to, I mean, it's table stakes to be able to touch your phone and get the world's library, right? It's or whatever song you want to listen to. Well, that's in the vehicles too, and it's in the current generation of internal combustion vehicles, of course. But what do you see what's going to be in the next generation of electric vehicles? I mean, it's going to be so neat, and
we'll all want one immediately.
That's right. And we'll expect it. And in 10 years, I can't even imagine. I mean, by the time we're forced to be buying these things in Canada, and it's going to be similar in a lot of the places that your viewers live, you're just going to have to. There's no other option. Yeah. Boy, it's going to be really neat to be sitting in these things.
Yes. Well, a lot of parts of Asia, are very electrified.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I lived in Singapore 20 years ago, and we already had, the barcoding and in the cars to let you in and out of the city. It would go beep beep and take the $3 entry fee. Now, they were way ahead of the UK, Australia, New Zealand, those countries came a decade later. So Asia is very good at being very progressive, and there are lots of wonderful innovations going on. So I'm just wondering, just sort of, the last question is, as people reach out to you for advice, what would your advice be to them about, how to get this thing set up if they want to copy your initiative and establish an organization to help create a brand new industry and sort out, the supply chain? What would your advice be? You're obviously involved right at the very beginning. There must have been challenges. What could you share with them?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. I think it's identify what the value proposition is that your jurisdiction offers, because not everywhere in the world has got the kind of the full gamut of the supply chain that Canada does, but many jurisdictions have got a lot of it. So where are you strongest, and what are you going to leverage, I guess would be the first thing. But I think more importantly, and that's fairly obvious, because you're not going to start an organization like this without knowing what you're trying to put together. But partnerships. Work with whomever wants to help, because if everybody is, as I say, rowing in the same direction, you can get a lot further. And this is not, what we've set up is not a political entity. We're not a child of any government. We work with them. We are putting together strategies that we want to succeed because we want the country to succeed. Mm-hmm. So if any partner wants to jump along because they're in it for that reason, right? Sure. You'll get to where you need to get. And we're still, as you say, beginning our journey, but I'm really heartened by the number of people who want to be helpful here, whether they be whether with capital and money, whether it's just with brain power, whether it's everything, right? And it's from all parts of the country and all provinces. And so it's heartening because people see the opportunity. And I think that other jurisdictions are seeing the opportunity as well. You mentioned Asia. I mean, there's so much activity. But other countries that may not have seen themselves as part of the quote auto sector in the past can be part of the auto sector, because autos are changing. Mm-hmm.
It's a very entrepreneurial venture, and I know that you're going to have great fun, and I'm going to track your progress with great interest. Now, Matthew, there's one last question that I ask everyone, which is, if you found yourself at some point in the future promoted to a role called Chief Executive of the World, what would you put on the table for discussion in the first 100 days? What would be your priority?
Chief Executive of the World. Well, I mean, I fear for the world that's elected me to that position, but I would say look, we're going through some pretty rough times right now, and I think that's apparent to say. And you and I are sitting in places in the world that I think are somewhat insulated from those challenges. But I will say that we're not always going to be insulated, and the ripple effects are really quite dramatic, and we're seeing that even in what I'm doing with what's going on in Ukraine. Yeah. So I don't want to be trite and say world peace, but I would say be mindful that what's happening elsewhere can happen where you live too. Yeah. And so do your best to try to ameliorate where you live, and maybe that will be paid forward.
Sure, that's a great start. Thank you so much. It's been really wonderful having your time, and I know that people listening today will be as excited as I am about your initiative, which is to start a whole new industry and help to get all the elements of the supply chain to provide funding and to clear the path for them to grow, so that you can achieve this wonderful transition to electric vehicles. And it's a very exciting time. So I wish you all the best with that. And thank you so much for contributing some time today to Thrive 2030. Matthew from Accelerate, all the very best with your adventure.
Thank you so much, Pamela. All the very best to you.
You're welcome.